Screencast 5.7. This will be our last one about agriculture, specifically about meat production methods. We talked already about how reducing our meat intake is important as far as fighting climate change, mostly because it's an inefficient use of our resources. As you can see, it takes a lot of land to produce a kilogram of beef. As this chart shows, 30 square meters, over 30 square meters is needed to produce 1 kilogram of beef. And then, 20 square meters for pork or chicken, another 12 square meters for eggs, a lot less for the fruits or potatoes or the vegetables. And the reason it takes so much land is not because the cattle or the pork or the chicken need so much land, but because that land is needed to grow the food to support those animals. So this is kind of a fun chart that shows how much of the Earth's area is used for different types of food production. So if you start at the top level, right, 100% of the Earth's land area, 29% is, land, sorry, 100% of the Earth's surface area, 29% of that is land. And then of that 29%, another 71% is habitable. The other 30% is glaciers or barren. Of that habitable land, 50% is devoted to agriculture. So of the available land that we can live in as humans, we use 50% of it to grow crops. And of that 50%, another 77% is just for livestock, and then 23% of it is crops. And then as you get into lower percentages, right, where does that food go? How much of it is to plant-based food? How much of it is for meat and dairy? And that's just the land area. We haven't even considered how much water it takes. So the amount of water it takes to grow soybeans or eggs, right? It takes almost 10 times as much to produce beef as it does to produce the same amount of soy or eggs. So how do we do this? So high-density animal farming, also called feedlots. The acronym for this is CAFO, so Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. You see this with beef, you see this with dairy cows, you see this with hogs, and you see this with chickens and other types of poultry. And CAFOs, don't have a good reputation because there's very little room for the animals to have any part of their actual life cycle, right? They're raised in pens or stocks, and they don't get to graze or move around or be social or anything like that. Because they're raised in these pretty bad environments, with highly concentrated populations, disease is a problem, and so there's a lot of antibiotic use. And of course, we may talk about this. Extreme antibiotic use leads to drug-resistant bacteria. So it's an ever-changing battle that people are losing because certain antibiotics we use are no longer effective. Of course, this wouldn't happen if there weren't economic benefits, right? The land costs are minimized because you put the same number of animals on a larger area, it's going to cost more in terms of the land. It's easier to feed animals when they're all in the same place. And the amount of food energy that goes into production, you can increase that fraction, so it does make it a little more efficient from an energy standpoint. The environmental drawbacks, of course, I mentioned the bacterial resistant, similar to pesticides, where you get pesticide resistant pests. You also get antibiotic resistant or drug resistant bacteria. There's also, like we said, diseases. So there used to be a thing called mad cow, and the cows didn't actually go mad. It was just an infection in their brain, but the media picked it up as infection in your brain. Well, the cow must be insane. So it's called mad cow disease. But diseases like that exist because animals are concentrated in small spaces. Another major environmental problem is waste disposal. So these concentrated operations produce like just incredible amounts of manure, um, right? If you have a small CAFO, it's the same as producing like the same amount of waste 5,000 people would produce, which is a relatively like mid-sized town, I suppose. But a lot of this stuff can easily run off into waterways or infiltrate into groundwater. So there's a diagram here that shows how this waste is managed, right? There are these stormwater catch basins um, that can easily contain sewage. There are bunkers which can hold waste. Any animals die, like they have to be disposed of somehow, but often they're just left in big piles, right? There are sewage lagoons, and that's just where the sewage goes, like to sit there. Um, so all these ways that the CAFOs generate waste, and then the waste has to be managed. And then finally, also there are, not finally, but there are also the ethical concerns, right? Is it right to treat animals this way where they can't, act out their natural life cycle or their natural behaviors? How about the nutritional content of this food? So we're making all this food, but is it healthy for us? And this is one of the issues with cows. Cows evolved to eat grass, but most of the time we're feeding them grain, right? Corn or soy. And the reason we're feeding them this grain is because it's subsidized and it's cheap. And for some animals, since they don't have to live their entire life cycle, right? We're killing them and eating them before they complete their life cycle. They can be fed this grain or soy for the short amount of time that they're alive, and it doesn't have any, long-standing ill effects because they're killed ahead of time. But if they do that, is that meat as nutritious as if they were eating grass that they were evolved to eat? So CAFOs are one way that we can create or generate meat. Another way is free range grazing, and this touches on the important topic of rangelands. So rangelands are generally grasslands that are specifically used for cattle grazing. And this is the most common use of land in the United States. Like there's more land in the US that's used as rangelands than any other use. If you look around the world, the use of rangelands where some of it is residential, right? Some of it is populated and some of it is remote. In the US, it's mostly remote. In other parts of the world, it's more residential or otherwise populated. In the US specifically, you can see how a lot of the federal land in the West also is covered by rangeland. So why is it, what are the benefits of having the cattle grazing on the rangeland? So hoofed animals like cows and so forth can be raised on land that's too dry to farm, so you don't need to irrigate it or provide water to the animals that are living there. And overall, this uses less fossil fuel energy than feedlots, right? Because the animals are getting their food naturally, and you don't have to provide it to them. You don't have to truck them or move them around. They do all that themselves. All right, well, what are some of the issues with rangelands? Well, they are vulnerable to fires because they are dry. And so if we're talking about natural fires, then every once in a while, fire will burn and destroy some rangeland and makes it not usable for agriculture. And it does take them time, does take the rangelands time to recover. There can also be a fair amount of stream bank erosion. So places that our rangelands get eroded away and you end up having less rangeland than you did before. Surface water can be contaminated pretty easily. So of course, if the animals are in the surface water, they're defecating there. And so it is not usable for other purposes if the animals are defecating there. Of course, overgrazing is an issue, right? If the the animals are allowed to graze and graze and graze and you never move them, then they will eat all the grass and it will not come back. If that happens, then you could lose soil to wind erosion. Soils will not function anymore because they won't be able to retain water, and then overall biodiversity decreases. This is kind of a fun graphic that shows different animals that can be there when things are grazed properly, but then when things are overgrazed, then many animals or many plants die and there's no habitat for the animals. All right, so who determines what the condition of the soil is? A lot of environmental organizations will say that current rangeland are in poor condition, more than half due to overgrazing. The Bureau of Land Management tends to disagree with that, and they are, the government, but you could argue whether or not they're beholden to special interests. One regulation that covers rangelands, the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, where federal rangelands were common, but they were turned into a permit-based grazing system to prevent overgrazing. Critics of the Taylor Grazing Act say the low cost of permits essentially makes it free. There's no incentive for farmers to, not overgraze because the permits are cheap. They can always get another permit for another space. In fact, this is a money-losing endeavor for the government. Spends a lot more money on the management than they actually receive in fees, and so this is effectively subsidizing the grazing. Bureau of Land Management regulations, things they do manage, they try to focus on health of watersheds, habitat restoration, and other protections of the rangeland ecology. But a lot of these regulations don't necessarily involve environmental scientists, and the BLM managers are given a wide latitude to enforce their guidelines and their standards. So many reasons we should reduce meat consumption. Reduces carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen emissions. Right, methane, you might have heard of cow burps. Cows emit incredible amount of methane, and it's a really strong greenhouse gas. Right, we saw how much water, obviously beef, but then also chicken and pigs also use a lot of water. And so if we eat less meat, we'll end up using less water. The less meat we eat reduces the use of antibiotics or growth hormones required to grow those animals. Chances are good that soil quality will improve because animals are not overgrazing soil in the rangelands. And then overall, it reduces ethical concerns about animal treatment because animals will not be treated badly if we don't have to grow so much of them in CAFOs. All right, well, that is Screencast 5.7. Let me know if you have any questions.